And all right, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the First Tuesday Conservative live stream. Whether you're tuning in on the First Tuesday Conservative Facebook page or you're tuning in via Alpha News, we're happy to have you. Today, we have a very special guest, Daniel Di Martino, a young man who escaped Venezuelan socialism and now lives in the US, where he studies economics and has a message for us about the failure of Venezuela, his home country, and his predictions for America when it comes to economics and the recent push that we've been seeing from the far left to socialize the economy. Daniel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, First Tuesday Conservatives, for hosting me.
So I suppose from the top, I should ask you, what's your story? You started in Venezuela, but tell the viewers, how did you come to inhabit America?
Yeah, well, I came to the United States 4 years ago. I was 17 years old back then. And that was the year 2016, just before the presidential election here, actually. And well, I came here because I was looking for something better for myself and for my family. I'm the only one who came. My family ended up leaving to Spain afterwards. But I came to the United States specifically because if I had stayed in Venezuela, I tell people the best chance that I would have had in my life was to feed myself. A job would have paid for, in the best case, enough money to pay for food. That's not paying for rent. That's not having to pay for anything else, just food. And so I did not want that life. I did not want a life of not having electricity, of not having water, or, unreliable public utilities. I did not want a life where I could be threatened based on what I think and what I believe. So I looked for options to go to college after finishing high school in Venezuela. And I applied for many colleges, right? And I got an interview with one of them that was in Indiana, and they give me a scholarship that they give only to one student per year, completely paid for my education. And that's why I was able to come here in 2016, and I finished my college degree early in December, and I'm working in Kentucky. Since I came to the United States, what I've been able to do, what I've had the honor, but also I would say the duty to do, is talk about socialism, right? Because these policies that destroyed my country of Venezuela are being proposed today in the United States by many politicians. And that is very worrisome. I tell people, Kyle, that if the United States open its doors to me, it is my duty to stop this country from going the way that Venezuela went, right? I don't want to have to escape again, right? That's the least I want.
Well, that's a very inspiring story. So tell me, you came here in 2016. What were the indications that it was time to jump ship and come to the US? What was life like in Venezuela when you left?
Yeah, for me and for most Venezuelans, it's not having electricity and not having water most of the time. I was weeks without water at home. So we had to purchase containers. We had to go ourselves and buy water to drink. We had to save water once there was service in the apartment in small pots so that we could shower, so that we could wash our hands. And then we just didn't have water. It was completely random. We wouldn't know. Electricity, at least once a week, we didn't have, we had a blackout. That was terrible because it's not just not having electricity, Kyle, but when there are sudden blackouts, electrical equipments go broke.
That's true.
And then you have to pay for a new fridge, and then you have to pay for a new oven. And we didn't have money for that to keep doing that. Right. We lived in a building. My grandparents, there were times we got trapped in the elevator because there was no electricity. It happened to me many times. Let me tell you that I got trapped in elevators because of that. My grandmother ended up being scared of elevators after all the times that it happened.
I would be too. And we're not talking about some sort of barren wasteland here. Venezuela is an oil-rich country. What happened that took Venezuela from being a wealthy, oil-rich country to somewhere where you can't trust the reliability of elevators?
Yeah, so it's very simple. At least those two areas of electricity and water, the government nationalized electricity and water services. And what they did was, we're going to give away electricity and water for free because the people have a right to electricity and the people have a right to water. That's what the dictator Hugo Chavez said. And because they nationalized those businesses and it was free, that meant there was no money to actually pay for the maintenance of the cables, of the pipes. And so you saw how people didn't have water in their homes, but there were water spills in the middle of the roads everywhere. because the pipes broke, because there was no maintenance. You saw how the government blamed iguanas. I'm not kidding, iguanas for eating the cables when it was a lie, was because they didn't maintain them. More recently, Maduro has blamed Marco Rubio and the CIA for cyber attacks against the electric grid. They say it's their fault. Really? When we know the electricity problems come many, many years ago. I know it, right? Because I lived it. But the biggest problem that Venezuelans now have is also the shortages of food and most goods, right? Having to do lines for toilet paper, having to do lines for flour, having to do lines for chicken. I've had to do lines and then not being able to find food because there was nothing. I've had to give so this is probably the worst of all the rationing systems that we had in Venezuela. We had to use our national ID number to know which day we could go to the supermarket.
Really?
My national ID ended in number 1, which meant that I could go on Mondays and Saturdays. I could not go on a Tuesday to the supermarket because there wasn't, the government wouldn't let you purchase things. And so it happened to me many times that I had forgotten my ID. And because I had forgotten my ID, they wouldn't let me buy, meat, which is ridiculous, right? There was one time where they denied me to purchase food because I was a minor. So minors can't buy food, I guess. I guess minors don't eat, That was the excuse they did to me one time. And I was so furious. One time they later installed a fingerprint system where you had to put your fingerprint so they would find you in the system and see if you had fulfilled your quota, because there was a quota of how much you could purchase. And so this lady, the cashier, wanted me to put the fingerprint to buy the things. And I was so mad. I didn't want to do it, but I needed to buy the things. Yeah. So I just spit on my finger and I put the fingerprint on the machine. And I say it and it's hilarious, but it's really a desperate and sad situation.
That's true.
People are dying in Venezuela of hunger because of what's going on, because there's no food. And there's no food because the government destroyed our economy. They destroyed by taking away businesses, by over-regulating them out of existence. And when you do that, then there's nothing to produce. Prices go up because they also print money for all their welfare programs. And we had hyperinflation, we had shortages, and all of that results in a hungry population. And that's what socialism does.
That's horrible. That's horrible. For those of us who are just tuning in, I'm here with Daniel Di Martino, a young man who escaped Venezuelan socialism and is here talking about his experiences and his thoughts on current American politics. So I understand just from reading your work and seeing previous interviews that your parents owned a gas station in Venezuela prior to the socialist takeover. How did that business fare under socialism?
Okay, so this is so people get a picture, right? We actually started the gas station just as Chavez was getting into power in 1999. And we were making somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 a month, depending on the month. And that was good, right? That's what many Americans make.
That's not bad.
Right. Obviously, we could live well. And that was with British Petroleum, the oil company, right? You see BP gas stations all over the United States. Mm-hmm. The government of Chavez took over all those foreign oil companies. We started then our contract with the Venezuelan government oil company, PDVSA. Mm-hmm. And
that was newly formed under the socialist regime. That company did not
exist. The company existed from before, and we'll get to that about how socialism started even before Chavez, and Chavez just accelerated it.
Yeah.
But the point was that instead of sharing revenue with BP, we had now a contract with the government, and we actually got to keep all the revenue. So in paper, it was actually better for us. Right. However, because the government spent so much money on welfare programs and had to print so much money through the central bank to pay for those programs, instead of raising taxes, they just raised inflation, which is just a different form of tax. Right. Or purchasing power, despite making more money in our domestic currency, was smaller. Mm-hmm. We went from making thousands of dollars a month to in 2016 making less than 100, and then making $2 a day.
Yeah,
that's almost extreme poverty by any international measure.
Right.
And if we had stayed, we would be making less than $1 per day, and even less every year. And that's the reality for most Venezuelans. They capped prices of gasoline, so you couldn't change the price; it was capped. And then we ended up living off government subsidies. We went from being a successful private company to basically being on government welfare.
Right. And that's by no fault of your own business. That's simply because the Venezuelan government couldn't manage those resources properly, despite the fact that the country has massive, massive oil reserves. So you mentioned that BP and these foreign companies were disallowed from doing business in Venezuela. How was that idea pitched to the population? How was this idea of kicking out foreign investment and of moving to socialism marketed to the average Venezuelan? Because it's my understanding that that was a bit of a slower process and there was even some democratic elements. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so Venezuela became a democracy in 1958. Through the 1950s, we had what could we say kind of like a right-wing dictatorship.
Yep.
Obviously, there were no rights no political rights, but there were a lot of economic freedoms. So the country actually prospered economically during that time. After that, it also continued to prosper through the 60s. But as Venezuelans had the chance to vote, unfortunately, successive presidents started increasing government intervention in the economy. It was in 1976 that the oil industry was nationalized. And that meant, a complete destruction of our oil production. It started going down. The country started being in an economic crisis, despite the government having even more revenue than before. The government spent even more on their programs. Inflation went up, unemployment went up. Because that's something that people need to understand. Socialism fails not because just, the government doesn't manage things well. But why doesn't the government manage things well? Because what's the incentive for the government? It's for the president in turn to gain votes. How does the president gain votes? By lowering prices of the things he can get, making things cheaper, or by hiring more government workers, by giving more things for free. And so companies that are private, that are supposed to maximize their profits to be efficient, are not maximizing their profits anymore. So production goes down, and in the long term, the economy gets worse. In the short term, people might get, this injection of free things, but they're going to pay for them. And that's what happened. In the 90s, Venezuela liberalized its economy, allowed private investment in the oil industry. Things got better. But I say that it was very late, because by that time, the country was already in a big crisis. And even though things improved a little bit, Chavez was elected. And when Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, that was even, just a little bit before I was born. He started the process of nationalizing and destroying our economy through regulations, price controls including. Many of the ideas that were sold to us were, as you said, of foreign companies, right? They said that foreign companies took away their money out of Venezuela, and therefore, if we took them over, we would keep that money inside the country. Right. Yeah, but that means no future foreign investment in the country, right? And that's exactly what happened. You might be able to keep the profits in the short term, but nobody else is going to come and invest from abroad in your country. And that's what happened. Nobody else invested. And it sold in this promise of, but it's kind of like a mix between socialism and nationalism that just destroyed our economy, right?
Now, how quickly did things progress from socialism being instituted and the government taking over companies to what we saw, in more recent years of food lines and starvation? How rapid was that process?
Well, since Chavez became president, he became president in 1999, and shortages occurred already in the early 2000s, sporadic shortages, right? He took over, and you can find actually articles from back in 2004, I even believe, as far back as 2004, in the New York Times, which is no right-wing media source. You can find articles of milk. There's no milk in Venezuela, of specific products, because Chavez had taken over the main milk production facility. And over time, production kept going down. We couldn't import more milk. We became dependent on countries for our own food. And it was terrible. So you started things progressing gradually towards the complete destruction that we have today. So it was never from one day to the next. Right. Chavez never. This is why the Venezuelan example is so relevant for America. Yes. Because unlike Cuba, Cuba was a violent coup that resulted in the complete abolishment of private property. That's not what happened in Venezuela. In Venezuela was a democratic election in 1998 that allowed Chavez to come to power the following year, and in actually just a month after I was born, in February 1999. And from there, he gradually implemented the socialist policies of increasing government spending, of over-regulating the economy, of taking over private businesses. And as he did that, the economy gradually, of course, too, started going down. He had a huge advantage on his favor at the start. Oil prices were increasing very fast, and that allowed him to pay for a lot of the programs that he wanted to pay for. So inflation did not go up as fast as it would have otherwise. But, oil prices eventually come down, and even as oil prices go up, production kept going down. Today, Venezuela doesn't have one active oil well. We have the greatest oil reserves in the world. We could provide the entire world of oil if we wanted.
Yeah.
For many years, and nobody else will have to produce even a drop. And today, we're not extracting even one drop of oil.
Wow. It's kind of like that saying where if you put a frog in boiling water and slowly increase the heat, it'll never jump out. So I have to ask you, you saw the slow march of socialism in Venezuela. You saw these policies, slowly creeping up on the people and resulting in, the utter destruction of the country. Do you see parallels between that creeping leftism in Venezuela and the creeping leftism that some identify in America?
I do see parallels, and it's not even, sometimes it's not even a parallel, it's just a direct quote. You see people from like Ilhan Omar, you see people like Bernie Sanders, and you see people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, just to mention the most radical members. They're not even parallels. I mean, these people would be members of the Maduro regime if they were Venezuelans. I have no doubt. I mean, these are people who say that the fault of the economic crisis in Venezuela is of the United States.
Really?
Ilhan Omar has said that it is the United States' fault that Venezuela is destroyed. You can ask any Venezuelan, Kyle. They will completely disagree with her. Of all political beliefs, they will say she's completely crazy. Yeah. So I don't think she has ever spoken to any person from my country.
Because that's something I've heard a lot from American liberals is that, whenever communism fails, whenever socialism fails, it's the fault of some confounding variable. And I've heard from professors and journalists and politicians that the reason that Venezuelan socialism failed is because of American intervention or colonialism or all these things. But you say that's not the case.
And it's not even just me saying it as an individual. This is actually what I've been researching in my economics degree when I finished in December. I've done research projects, I've gotten grants to talk about this. There are economic models that explain that it's not because of oil, it's not because of sanctions, it's not because of anything but the specific socialist policies of price controls, of overspending, of over-regulation in general of the economy, of nationalizations that destroyed our country. I always use this comparison for people who say that it is US sanctions, that it's oil prices going down, or that it's corruption alone. I always put the example of Iran. Iran is a terrorist regime who oppresses their people. The Ayatollah is in power. It has even a religious component that Venezuela doesn't have. It's dependent on oil, and it's heavily sanctioned by the United States. In Iran, people are not starving in the street like Venezuelans. Right. What's the difference between Iran and Venezuela?
The economics.
In Iran, they're not as socialist as Venezuela. That's the only difference between Iran and Venezuela.
Yeah, that's a fairly stunning comparison. That it truly is the economic system that caused the failure of an oil-rich nation. So, are you concerned for the future of America at all? And does it worry you when you can come on air with us or go on Fox or have this media presence warning people and no one seems to pay attention? What does that feel like?
Well, I do think people pay attention, and I'm actually very hopeful of this country, because in Venezuela, we didn't have this. We did have people warn us, and the Cubans, because Venezuelans said that we would never become like Cuba. We're great. We have oil. We're so rich. That's never going to happen to us. We're not an island. That's the other argument. We're not an island, so it's not going to happen to us. Well, today Venezuela is poorer than Cuba, so it happened to us worse. And it didn't happen from one day to the next. So these things can happen anywhere. I'm hopeful because in America, there's a huge liberty movement that in Venezuela we never had. Even before Chavez, in Venezuela, most of the political system was just based on who was most leftist.
Right.
It was the people who were just moderate and the people who were just very left wing. And then Chavez got in power, who was very, very left wing. Mm-hmm. But we never had a real conservative or economically free government that wanted to reduce taxes, that wanted to reduce regulations, balance the budget. We never had something like that. And because we never had something like that, the only time we implemented free market reforms was when the IMF came to get their debt and they just forced the government to do it, but never out of their own political will. The United States is a very different country. The United States is a country founded upon the ideals of freedom, a country that never had a dictatorship, a country that has the longest running continuous constitution in the world. It might not be the oldest country in the world, but it's the oldest country that with a constitution that is still active, that it hasn't been just completely scrapped and rewritten. Chavez rewrote the constitution in 1999. That's something that can't happen in this country.
Right.
So I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful for the people. I think there's a threat, and they are going to try to do it very gradually, which is why we cannot let them do one more step. We need to take steps in the other direction. We also cannot just stay and say, we reject socialism, let's stay in the status quo. No, we have to go the other way, the opposite way of socialism, so that it's harder for them to go back in the way of socialism.
Yeah. Speaking of socialism in America, I know we were discussing a little bit earlier, ties between American activists and different American figures and the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Could you describe that for us? Because I think this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is that there's certain individuals in the US that were directly influenced by the Venezuelan regime.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you several people, and I'm actually going to share my screen.
Of course.
So Black Lives Matter, of course, the organization, not necessarily like everybody who protests or anything, but the leaders of the organization are Marxists. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody has seen the picture of the leader with, let me share my screen here. Everybody has seen the picture of the leader of Black Lives Matter, one of the founders, Opal Tometi, in Harlem, in Manhattan in 2015 with Maduro. Of course, Maduro was very happy for the photo op, and so were they, of supporting a dictator. And Obama, of course, didn't do anything about it and let Maduro walk around New York City completely impune of his crimes, because he had just killed protesters in Venezuela, and they allowed him to fly to New York City and have the great life there. Not anymore.
This is as he is suppressing anti-socialists, as he's suppressing protesters, as he's killing them.
As he's killing them in 2015.
At the same time.
This is the picture that they take in New York City, and Obama did nothing about it too.
Jeez, and that's the Black Lives Matter co-founder there on the right. And
now what I'm going to show you is that in the United States, there are foreign state media outlets who, in my opinion, I'm not even sure how they're allowed to operate in this country. Free speech is for individuals, for American organizations, or individuals, whether they're American or not, but not for Russia to pay for, the Russian government or the Qatari government to pay for propaganda.
Right.
So in 2019, as the Venezuelan people rebelled against their regime, our Venezuelan embassy was occupied by American left-wing activists.
And that's the Venezuelan embassy in the United States?
In the United States, in Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown area.
Okay, I've been there.
It was occupied by American left-wing activists. I'm going to show you. They were eventually expelled thanks to the District of Columbia Police. They were given their own taste of socialism. They were... it was very funny because instead of just going and raiding it, they just closed them off and didn't allow them to have food or electricity inside. So I thought that was a very appropriate way to do it.
Yeah.
Let me show you what Maduro did to the heroes. He brought them, these American citizens. This is Maduro's official Twitter account, as you can see, July 31st, 2019. He greeted them. This is him congratulating these Americans for standing up against Donald Trump and for, he gave them the sword of our national founder, of Simon Bolivar. That's how he destroys our national symbols.
Yeah.
And these are American citizens who now live in the United States, and nobody does anything about them. There are sanctions that anybody who collaborates with the regime is actually, doing illegal activities.
Right.
And nobody does anything about that. I'm concerned. I think those people are trying to destabilize this country.
Could you go back to that tweet for a second and
Yes.
read what is written there?
Yes. So yeah, it probably won't translate, but it says our gratitude and recognition and eternal recognition to the protective collective of our diplomatic headquarters in Washington. Your actions reflect your high morals and defense for dignity and sovereignty of the Venezuelan people.
So just to reiterate, this is a socialist foreign dictator inviting American activists to lay hands on Bolivar's sword and congratulating them with high honors for their left-wing activism in the United States. This is
in Caracas, less than a year ago.
Less than a year ago, these people were resisting Trump and they got praise from a socialist regime in Venezuela, and America doesn't appear to do anything about it. What do you think should be done about that type of foreign interference?
Well, I would send all those people to jail under the, I know there are foreign interference, there are laws against foreign interference in the United States, and there are sanctions against Venezuela and against anybody who interacts with members of the Maduro regime. Right. So I personally would also not allow state media outlets like Russia Today, like Al Jazeera, like, there are Chinese media outlets as well in the United States. Oh, yeah. I'm not saying that Chinese people or Russians or Venezuelans, I'm Venezuelan, can't express ourselves. But I'm saying that foreign authoritarian governments should have no say in the United States. And these people are pushing millions of dollars into trying to brainwash Americans. I think that's dangerous and shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, the First Amendment applies to American people, not foreign propaganda operations. I tend to agree with you on that, but I suppose that's up for our viewers to decide. When I was doing a little bit of background research for this interview, I found a photograph of you in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump. And I feel that as we approach the 2020 elections, I have to ask the question. Oh, there it is. That's very cool.
I have it here. Yep.
I have to ask the question, as somebody who escaped socialism, what's your opinion on President Trump, and how do you see America's reaction to him?
Well, so I'm a fan of many of his policies. I think that he has done really great on the economy. I think that he has done really great with the tax reform. I think deregulation, that's the kind of measure that I'm talking about, that it's going the opposite way of socialism. Because now a Democratic president is not just going to come and pile up new regulations. They're going to have to undo what he did, right? Previous Republican presidents never destroyed regulations like he did. Not even Bush, not even George Bush the father, not even Ronald Reagan repealed as many regulations as President Trump did. So that's great because it really slows down and goes the opposite way of socialism. And that's what we need to keep doing so that businesses thrive, so that the economy thrives. And as the economy thrives, people are less likely to vote for a socialist. Right. Because the breeding ground of socialism is economic despair.
Right.
If we have a strong economy, socialists have no chance, which is why COVID-19 is so dangerous, right? Because we're in a crisis to no fault of anyone's or of anyone in the United States, at least. The Chinese do have fault. So I think that's great what he's done. And I hope that continues. I don't agree with everything the president says or does at all. But I agree with his economic policies, and I'm very happy as well of his stance against international authoritarian regimes like Venezuela, which is what we talked about when I went to the Oval Office. And he was really great, really focused on what Venezuela was like for me, what we can do to free Venezuela, and how we go forward, right? And I think he has been the first president to really put a focus on countering socialism abroad.
And you just presented me with the perfect segue. What is the steps going forward for Venezuela? What do you predict for the future of the country? How do you predict America will interact with them? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm concerned that Venezuela is becoming just another Cuba.
Right.
Where it's been 60 years under, an embargo and no one else does anything about it. And the problem with that is that Cuba is not just contained in itself. Cuba sponsors other socialist governments. Right. Venezuela wouldn't be a socialist country today if Cuba had been a free country.
Yep.
Something most people don't know about is that in the 60s, Cuba tried to invade Venezuela militarily, like by land. By sea, but they got into our coast and sent troops. They lost, and that's the reason they were expelled of the Organization of American States, because they tried to invade Venezuela, and it was a motion of Venezuela to expel them. It was not the United States to expel them.
Sure.
They lost, and then they won democratically with Chavez. Mm-hmm. Today, we run the risk of letting Venezuela become that breeding ground. And Venezuela is not just a socialist state. People need to know this. Venezuela is also a state that sponsors terrorism and narco trafficking. It's very well known. This is why the president sent an operation to the Caribbean through Southcom to capture drug traffickers and to stop drugs from getting into the United States, cocaine especially. The nephews of Maduro, his nephews, are in jail in New York City for trying to bring 1 ton of cocaine from Haiti to the United States.
A ton of cocaine.
A ton of cocaine.
Wow.
These are the nephews of the dictator. They're not the only ones. The Mexican cartels traffic their drugs. They get cultivated in the south of Colombia, and all the drugs then get transported from Venezuela to Mexico, and then from Mexico to the United States.
So in addition to Venezuela having sort of a corrupt ideological influence on certain people inside America, there's also a criminal element as they sponsor these drugs and this terrorism. I think that's interesting.
Because that's how they stay in power. And This is why this is so important to understand for how to free the country. Because they don't have any more money from oil or any kind of taxation, because they run the economy to the ground because of socialism. The way they pay off the people with the guns, who are the military, is through drugs. They get a share of the drug trafficking proceeds. They get a share of also illegal mining proceeds. They get a share of terrorism. So you can also find reports in the Department of State's website about how they have found Hezbollah training facilities in Venezuela. It's a very dangerous thing what's going on. They have given Venezuelan passports to Middle Eastern citizens who are actually not Venezuelan citizens. They just come, they're terrorists. Yeah. They come to Venezuela, they're given Venezuelan passports, and then they travel to Mexico and try to cross the southern border. They have captured hundreds of people like that. President Trump actually imposed sanctions on everybody who works for the Venezuelan passports services because they were giving passports to terrorists who were not Venezuelans. So this is very worrisome. How do we free the country, right? How do we end this criminal enterprise that controls it? I'm convinced that peaceful protests are not going to do it. And I'm going to connect this with another point, which is the Second Amendment. Venezuela doesn't have a Second Amendment. Venezuelans are not widely armed like Americans, which is another thing that gives me hope in case something happens in this country. If things go to worst, here people have weapons and they're going to fight the government. And that's the way it is. And in Venezuela, we can't do that because we don't have weapons. So that's why Venezuela is not a free country today. Sometimes people, criticize me because I say that people should go and die and do a civil war in Venezuela. But how did the United States become a free country? The United States didn't become a free country by telling England, please British Empire, free us from your chains. Everybody just put a white shirt and the signs of peace, please, liberty and independence. That's not how it works. They took up arms and there was a war for independence. That's how things work, right? That's how you get your independence. And that's what we need to do in Venezuela. And because we don't have weapons, what I propose is that, the president continues to do what he's doing with sanctions and pressure through, capturing the drugs that come from Venezuela that reduces the revenue of the regime. But then let's capture some of the members of the regime. Right now, they're trying to, they actually caught one guy who was traveling outside. He's one of the main financiers. He's a Turkish businessman. And he's in Cabo Verde, an African islands, where his plane had to get some gas. And the US authorities caught him there. Now they're trying to extradite him to America. We can do that to many more people. We could send operations to capture them inside Venezuela individually. This is not, a war or anything, but capturing individual members of the regime. Give a call to Maduro. Hey, Maduro, you're next. If you don't leave power to the democratic, process.
Yeah.
And, these people have a lot of money. If they're giving a way out and a threat that something's gonna happen to them, or many of the regime members have families in America who they say they're not pro-regime, their families, right? But obviously, yeah, of course, the whole family who lives off the money, they're not pro-regime.
Yeah.
Take the families. Take the families to jail in this country and tell them, if you want to see your family again, you have to leave the Maduro regime and turn in yourself.
What I'm seeing here is that you're not advocating this because you're some sort of war hawk or, you love invading other countries. You're advocating this because Venezuela poses a real and understated threat to the security of the United States.
It does. It is about terrorism. It is about drug trafficking. Thousands of the Southcom of the Department of Defense recently said that the drugs that they have captured that come from Venezuela could have killed 10,000 Americans, just the ones they were able to cut. 10,000. Chavez himself he before he died, right, and now Maduro, he directed cocaine trafficking to the United States. There are recordings of him saying that he wanted to inundate America with cocaine to kill people.
It is a war on the United States.
Yeah, it is a war on the United States because what's the crown, the jewel of the crown they want to conquer? They want to conquer America. They want to export their socialist model to America.
Yeah.
You know that they're exporting their socialist model to Spain. They financed with 5 million euros a communist party in Spain that now is the vice president of the Spanish government, Pablo Iglesias. You can find him, how he worked for Chavez. And these people are now the government of Spain, where my family lives. So I'm very concerned about them. I want them to come here as soon as possible because these people are expanding. People think that you can contain socialist governments, and you can't. No. And this is not China, right? This is not a huge country with nuclear weapons or anything. This is an unstable regime in South America that is just 2 hours away from Miami, that is bringing drugs to the United States, and that is starving millions of people.
Yeah, and we're practically allowing them to do it. Speaking of your family in Spain, do you have friends and family still in Venezuela, and have you gone back to the country since you left?
Yeah, so I have one uncle and several cousins in Venezuela, plus many friends, right, from school, from other activities that I still have there. I keep in touch with them often to see what's going on the ground.
Yeah.
And it's very, very sad. People are honestly just hopeless at this point. And, believe it or not, Trump is very liked in Venezuela, very well liked, probably more than in any other country in the world because of his stance against a dictator. So people actually have a lot of hope in Venezuela for President Trump. These are just the facts.
Yeah.
And it's good that they have something to be hopeful for. But at the same time, it's sad that that's all they can do, because it's not like they can take up arms themselves and try to free the country, which is what, if I had guns, at least it would be a different story, right? We could have tried. So I do have those family members there and my friends. Yeah. but now I have friends all over the world, right? Venezuelans have left to Colombia, to Peru, to Mexico, Canada, Europe, Asia, America, right? I have, people who I studied from preschool in Venezuela who now live in Ohio and now live in Florida and Virginia, everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I can probably anticipate the answer to this next question, but I think it's important to get it on the record. Why don't more people leave Venezuela?
Okay, well, so a lot of people have left.
Yeah.
5 million out of 30 million people.
It's a lot.
So you get an idea, the United States has 330 million inhabitants.
Yep.
That would mean like 55 million people live in this country. That is like the whole West Coast, Western states of California, of Oregon and Washington leaving the country, all the people. It would be a massive refugee crisis.
Yeah.
More people don't leave because it's costly to leave. Young people are the ones who leave usually, people my age, people the age of my parents, but older people are not leaving. So the people who are staying in Venezuela are the old people, unfortunately. And the other reason it's legally difficult too. A lot of people have left Venezuela because we have families who came from other countries. Venezuela was a country of immigrants, just like the United States. And I wanted to mention this because there were so many similarities between America and Venezuela. In 1950, we were the fourth richest country in the world, and America was the first. We had people from Europe, from Latin America, from Asia, from everywhere coming to our country as immigrants and making good lives for themselves because there was work. There wasn't a tolerant culture that accepted people, and people came from all over the world. Just like people came from all over the world to the United States.
Yeah.
And we went from being that rich country of immigrants to being this destroyed socialist economy. More people don't keep leaving because once 5 million have left too, they send remittances back home. That's actually what's keeping many people alive in the country today, remittances.
Yeah, yeah.
And then this is something else I want to mention, and I told you before we went live about how it's legally difficult to leave because the government is not giving passports to people.
Right.
It's unlike Cuba. In Cuba, it's banned to leave the island, and it's an island. It's easier to regulate when people escape. But Venezuela is a country in South America. The border with Colombia is very, very long. We also have a border with Brazil, and I'm talking about jungles and rivers, and it's impossible to guard it. It's impossible to build a wall or to do anything like that. It's mountains.
Right.
So people escape illegally now because Maduro has decided to not print them passports. And if you want a passport, you have to bribe a government official, pay them thousands of dollars when people are not making even $100 a month. The average person makes $10 a month now. It's nothing, right? That's what most Americans make, more than that per hour.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, so you've got a country that will issue passports to terrorists and help them move around, but restricts its own starving citizens. As we approach the end of the interview, I want to ask you, what do you think should be done from the perspective of American conservatism to help Venezuela? Because I remember a time not that long ago where we were seeing terrifying headlines about how people were forced to eat zoo animals, and pictures of the bread lines and pictures of the devastation that Venezuelans are enduring. But now it feels like a lot of that media focus has dissipated and people have stopped thinking about Venezuela, and it almost appears like the problem has resolved. But of course, as you've explained, it has not. So what do American conservatives need to do moving forward to keep this issue on the forefront of people's minds?
Yeah, it has not. Things have just gotten worse. But of course, when a big event doesn't happen, it stops the news cycle caring about it. I recently saw a video of a poor woman in Venezuela who her brother had died because he was so hungry that he ate a frog.
Oh.
And when you eat a frog, you die. They're poisonous. You can't eat them. But he had nothing else to eat. He just caught a frog, a wild frog, and he died. And this is happening to many people. Venezuelans are killing themselves at the highest rate in history. There was one kid in a school in Caracas, where I'm from, who killed himself and left a note to his parents saying that he can't stand the fact that they can't purchase food, so he'd rather kill himself to not be a burden on his family. that's happening in our country. So I think that the best thing conservatives can do, because of how limited we are in actually even sending humanitarian aid, it's
Right.
sometimes even worse because they will steal it. It's supporting the people who are coming to America or who are already in America. There are about 500,000 of people from Venezuelan descent. Half of them are not U.S. citizens. So there's about 250,000. Most are in the state of Florida. These people need our support because more people like myself who tell the story of socialism, it's helpful to our cause of keeping this country free. And so a lot of Venezuelans are coming here and are asking for asylum, but it takes years. Sometimes their claims are not carefully considered. Sometimes they don't even have access to good lawyers. So, advocating for helping Venezuelans who are in the United States is good. Some are actually, there's actually some who come here and ask for asylum but are kept in ICE facilities. So there's about 300 Venezuelans who are in ICE facilities. And they're not criminals, they're just here on asylum, but they just keep them there because they're afraid they won't show up to court. But they can't deport them either because there are actually no flights to Venezuela. So there are people who have been years in a jail and they're basically on life sentence, even though they didn't commit any crime. So I advocate out for them a lot because they don't deserve that coming from where they come from. And they're just an asset to this country. So I think that we should help them.
And it seems sort of unjust that we're allowing massive influxes of people across our southern border that, have no restrictions on their movement. And then people come from Venezuela, people that really deserve a chance to join America, and they're stuck in these facilities. That doesn't feel right at all. I don't like that.
Yeah.
I suppose I have to ask, you're a young guy that came here and received an education and is very interested in economics. What are your plans moving forward in the United States?
Yeah, so I live in Kentucky now. I'm leaving my job in a month and I'm gonna move to New York City, the big liberal city. I'm moving because I'm starting a PhD in economics at Columbia. Sure. So I'm gonna be there for approximately the next 5 years. And I'm gonna keep speaking out, right? I'm gonna keep speaking out on TV, on events. Hopefully the virus situation ends soon. Yep. And we can start more in-person things as I've done. I've spoke at CPAC more recently. That was just before the whole lockdown started happening. And I think that, it's my purpose in life. I don't want America to go the same way. And I'm concerned at politicians in the Democratic Party who are proposing the same ideas. More recently, I saw how Kamala Harris called for national rent control. I saw how, rent control is what we had in Venezuela. So nobody rented their apartments and people were homeless. That's what happens with rent control. You don't have to be a genius or an economist.
It doesn't work.
You see people like AOC who say you have to cap, and it sounds good for people who don't think about it more deeply. Cap interest rates on credit cards. What happens if we cap interest rates? I know it sounds small, it's not significant. But people who have bad credit are not going to be given a credit card because they're too much of a risk. Young people and poor people are not going to get credit cards. They're not going to increase access. So regulations just decrease access. They don't help anyone. So I'm going to keep speaking out against those ideas because they go step by step, right? First they cap rent. Then they cap credit card rates. Then they want to give housing for free. Then they want to give education and healthcare, and the country goes bankrupt after you grow up, and in 10 years it's unrecognizable.
Like you were just saying, it's not even parallels to Venezuela. It's a mirror image of some of the exact same policies that we saw, down south in Venezuela. Very disturbing stuff. Yeah.
So after I finish my PhD, I hope to continue here in this country and eventually become an American citizen and continue contributing to this awesome nation. I love it.
I can say I'm very glad to have you here. I'm glad to have you on this interview. I'm glad that you're spreading this message. I think more people need to hear it. In summary, is there anything else you'd like to add that we didn't get to discuss that you want to say while we're still streaming?
If anyone has a question, I guess, I don't know if anybody wants to send a question, send it in the chat or any comment, and I'd be happy to answer any question.
Absolutely. Are we seeing any questions in the chat? This is the part where we run into some technical issue inevitably.
I know.
Oh,
Oh, well, they can find me if you guys want to continue following my work and checking out what I speak about on all these things. You can follow me on Twitter at Daniel Di Martino. It's just my first name and last name. And you can check out my website, www.danieldimartino.com. You can find my name in the box right here at the bottom left. And it's just at my name, and that's easy. Robert asked, are churches suppressed there, right? Am I reading this right?
Yep, that's what he said.
So yes and no. It's not as much as Cuba or the Soviet Union was, that they just implemented state atheism. In Venezuela, the regime actually first tried to kidnap the religion, and they started, we're a Catholic country mainly, and the government, Chavez, started making himself as if he was the Messiah. So he put his face in the rosary, in the Holy Rosary.
Did he really?
Oh, he did, and it was red, because red is the color of socialism there.
Astounding.
And so they made red rosaries with his face. It's completely sacrilegious and disgusting.
Was his face? I'm just curious. Was his face where the cross is on the rosary?
It is. So it is just above it. Yeah. Just above it. Not the cross was still the cross, right, with Christ. Yeah, it was, and that's just one thing. Since the other things related to religion in Venezuela is that since the Maduro and Chavez regime started, we started seeing an increase in these folk religions that are basically satanic. The people who dress completely in white and sacrifice animals, the santeros, that's how we call them. There's some of them in South Florida. It's a religion that usually comes from Cuba and some Caribbean islands, but we didn't have that in Venezuela before. All the Jewish people escaped because there actually was a big attack against Jewish people in Venezuela, and Chavez was very outspokenly anti-Semite. And we had, a considerable tens of thousands of people of Jewish descent, and they all left, Israel, the United States, other countries. And today, the people who are in the church, Catholic Church mainly, who are suppressed, are those who speak out against the regime. There's a very famous priest, Padre Palmar, from Western Venezuela, and he's very short, but he has a huge Twitter following, and he's, a great speaker. And he goes to rallies against Maduro and he speaks. And he's a Catholic priest, and he's right to do this. I like it. But the government just went in one day, and thugs broke his legs. So that kind of persecution happens if you speak out.
Now, how wide is the scale of that style of persecution? If you go to a protest in Venezuela, what are the odds that you don't come home?
Wow. Okay. If you're in front of the protest, the odds are pretty high.
Wow.
The odds are pretty high. It really depends on how many people attend. If there's more people, the odds of you being the one who gets caught are lower, of course. I've been to those huge protests because the chances were lower. But if you're in a small protest, the chances are very high that you will get caught.
They do actively oppress these people. And what does that process look like after somebody's arrested? Is there any adequate legal process, or do they just disappear?
Most of the times they just disappear them. They're sent to a place called El Helicoide. You can find them. You can Google it, El Helicoide. It's basically the secret prison underground where they torture people. It's in Caracas. And you can see videos and read testimonies of the people who came from those places. I have a friend who was caught in one protest. And he was tortured, and thankfully he was released because he was not a big political guy. He was just, a young guy in a protest. That's all he was.
Yeah.
These are people who are not destroying anything. They're just protesting with signs, peaceful things. Perhaps it shouldn't be that peaceful. That's the issue, right? When you're against a tyrannical government. Yeah. So I've seen many videos of these tortures. Sometimes it's not even in a helicoide. It's outside in the street. They take you to a place where there's nobody else, and then they torture them there. And it's the same procedure they do to people in different places. And that's what makes me think that it's systematic. It's trained. The police are trained to torture people in this way.
It's not just a random thing. You see the same atrocities playing out time and time and time again. And of course, that pales in comparison to the scale of the starvation and the desperation we see in Venezuela. Really.
Right. You were saying it right before we spoke, before we went live, about it has to be a very dire situation so that the political repression pales in comparison to the starvation.
Yeah, exactly. When the situation is so bleak and so terrible that, torture is relatively less bad than the rest of the circumstance, you're dealing with some pretty nasty stuff. I see another interesting question in the chat. Do you feel that people that you know back in Venezuela are endangered by your activism in America?
So I think they could be, yes. But they are, to the degree that the government could think that they are stopping me or others from speaking out.
Yeah.
Right. So of course I would care if something happens, but because I'm not going to stop doing it,
Right.
I'm not going to give them the incentive to do something like that or believe that, because my parents are not there, my closest family are not there. I feel much safer to speak it, right? If my parents were in Venezuela, I wouldn't be doing any of this.
Yeah.
Because that would actually stop me from speaking. But if I don't speak out, who's going to speak out? Right? Everybody has friends and family there. I'm lucky that I don't have my closest family, so I feel like it's my duty to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said your parents are in Spain now.
Yes. So are my grandparents and some of my uncles. Well, and the other issue is that I know that I can't go back to Venezuela, right? If I were to go back, I'd definitely be arrested.
Yeah, well, that's terrible. You have no
intention. I met with President Trump. I mean, these people know who I am.
Yeah, you're not exactly a low-profile individual. Thank goodness, because you're spreading a very, very important message. Well, I don't see any more questions in chat. It's been a wonderful conversation that we've had. Thank you so much for coming onto the stream. Thank you so much for spreading your message. Please continue to spread your message. I'm sure you will.
Thank you, Kyle. You too. Continue your great reporting for Daily Caller and Alpha News. I've seen your videos for during the riots, and that's very important to cover.
Yeah, well, it absolutely is. But I'll keep it up. Thanks for coming on. Everybody, this has been Daniel Di Martino, a young man who escaped Venezuelan socialism, explained to us what happened in his home country and related some of his experiences and what he witnessed in Venezuela to the current situation in America. I know the last couple times you've tuned into the First Tuesday Conservative Group, we've been talking about foreign issues. And the reason for that is that it's important to be aware that America does not exist in a bubble. Around the nation, there are individuals that are, suffering and having political struggles of their own, and we need to pay attention to them because they can inform the struggles that we're facing here. Daniel explained to us connections between the American far left and the Venezuelan socialist regime. Those cannot be overlooked. Neither can we overlook the direct security threat that Daniel highlighted that is posed by Venezuelan drug trafficking and terrorism. Daniel, thank you again for joining us, and tune in next Tuesday at 6:30 for another interview. See ya.